Thank you for the invitation, financial investigator and family offices. It is a pleasure for me to be able to speak to you and share our macroeconomic outlook. I am the chief economist since actually December 1st, taking over from Han de Jong, who you probably have already met for many times for presentations. Now, before I start my slides, I would just like to spend a minute on talking to you about how we see this animal that has hit our economies in the last few months. And I think it's good to kind of keep in back of the mind. So if you zoom out, like what is really going on? Because many comparisons to the financial crisis of 29 have been made. We think this is incorrect for many reasons. Now, what this crisis in essence is, it is a combination of three elements. One, a supply shock to the economy that happened as soon as the production house of the world, which is China, came to a standstill in February. Now, as the virus came over to let's say, the Western world, this also created a demand shock, which came on top of the supply shock. So supply shock means that supply chains are disrupted. There is a lot of disturbances in all kinds of value chains. Global trade is shrinking. And when the virus hit the Western world, basically, in effect, when the lockdowns were introduced, we got this huge standstill of economic and social activity in the public arena. And that really led to a huge drop in consumption. That together, of course, led to investor uncertainty and in a second round effects, I will come to that later, we will see unemployment rising, investor appetite decreasing, and the likes. So, but the third element, and that's also important, is that all this is happening idiosyncratically, simultaneously, it means, in many parts of the world. So these three things make this shock much, much deeper than the financial crisis ever was. At the same time, it is lighter in the sense that this is not, opening up some fundamental problem to the economy or to the financial sector, because in actual fact, they were actually in a pretty healthy state before we went into this crisis, and the crisis is biology born and not economic born. So I think that's a good point to start with. Now, I would like to now start sharing my screen. I have 10 minutes, so I actually go through things a little bit faster than I normally do, but I'm open to questions. And if you have questions, with hindsight, you can always email me or Group Economics. We can give you additional insights. Now, I'm actually not able to click through. Yeah. Question, is somebody else clicking through for me now, or did it just work by accident?
Yes, by accident.
Okay, so when I do it again, it might work again. Okay, so I want to start with a little background on how we actually construct scenarios, because these are not the times to claim certainty about anything in the future. These are times to make scenarios, a base case, a positive, and a negative. Now, what is driving these scenarios is basically two things. One, how long was the lockdown lasting? And two, how big will the second round effects be? And of course, the lockdown, how long that lasted after the first wave, that is now clear because we're in the process of unlocking. But that is the main driver of how bad an economy is hit. I will get back to that. And of course, second round effects, which I will explain in detail. Now, a second thing is that we entered this lockdown or this crisis, and we had to come up with an idea of what is essential to consumption and what is not. And what we found out is that if we look at our real-time data, which we actually from day to day analyze based on millions of PIN and ideal transactions that our clients with bank accounts undertake, we see that about 30% of the total consumption that we undertake is actually not essential. And of that 30%, 70 to 90% was completely wiped out. Now, obviously, tourism and hospitality are very hard hit sectors because that was just impossible. Now, second round effects, which are still about to come, we're now and just entered the third quarter, so the two first days of the third quarter. And what we're seeing now is an uptick, which is partly a statistical rebound and partly real recovery. But the second round is still to come, which means a combination of higher unemployment, corporate defaults, financial tightening of the conditions, capex slump, and supply side disruptions. That is still ahead of us. Now, how big that is going to be depends on many factors. So, one, how long the lockdown was, but also what the government and the central banks are doing to as a counterweight. Now, and then adding that up, the question is really what kind of recovery are we going to expect? Will it be V shaped? We think not. Will it be U shaped? Much more likely. And in a real bad condition, in a negative scenario, it might even be L shaped. Now, in any case, the recovery will be very slow, and activity will be below potential for a long time to come. And The Economist has made this famous quote that we're basically, as long as there is no vaccine or medicine, um, uh, we will be running an economy at 90%. Actually, in the Netherlands, we see in our real time data that looks more like we're running an economy of 95%. And it seems just 5%, but it makes a huge difference. Yes, it's working. Next slide. So we have three scenarios. Very quick, the base case is where we think is the most probable, which means that we keep gradually unwinding the measures and the economy will be gradually restoring as we are seeing now. But then in Q4, we will see the start of the second round effects, also Q1 2021. And only in the second half of 2021, we will really see growth picking up again in a sustainable manner. Now, that is all assuming that there will not be a second wave of the virus infection, because if that happens, we're basically back to kind of renewed lockdown situations, be it more local, be it less strict, but still lockdown, which will completely depress the economy going back towards the end of this year and next year. Miracles are never out of the world. So it could happen that there is a positive scenario, and that will mean we will have to very quickly be having a vaccine ready, distributed on a global scale, and people actually willing and ready to take this vaccine, which are all three very doubtful conditions. If that happens, it even would mean that a lot of the fiscal and monetary stimulus that is really aggressively out there right now will be withdrawn. So not everything is positive in the positive scenario. Okay, so what will happen to GDP? In the Eurozone, we think that 2020 will see almost 7% of shrinking of GDP. And that will mean an output gap of about 6.2%. So in the US, my slide is blocking it. I hope that that's not the case for you. The GDP effect for 2020 on average is a little bit less. It's minus 4.8, we think. That might be seen counterintuitive from what you read in the newspapers, but that is because the US is really always massively shrinking and massively recovering in a much more speedy pace. But these are the year-on-year numbers. Now, in the Eurozone, we usually look at the PMIs. And I mean, PMIs are much less reliable in these times, we found out, than they are in normal times. So the question is what they say. But PMIs have really dropped enormously. If you look at the PMIs, they usually have a big predictive power 6 months ahead to GDP. And what we saw, if you see the financial crisis, like in 29, you saw that PMI went down to about 35, and then GDP dipped just below 3%. However, what you see now is that the GDP is now almost at -4, but actually the PMIs, they have completely dipped below the chart, but are also now really jumping up. I can say many details about PMI, but I won't because I have just 10 minutes. Unemployment is a really huge component of what's going on.
Yeah, Sandra, sorry to interrupt you. We are a little bit on the tight in the schedule, so maybe if you can, let's say, focus on the essentials of your presentation, then we have still some room for questions from the panelists.
Yes, I'm just 5 minutes underway, by the way, but okay. But I'm just yeah. I'm gonna unemployment. I'll just keep this very short. We think in the eurozone this will end up at 12%, which is very high, and it will be very unequally distributed if there's no recovery fund. Now I will skip this. I find this fascinating, but it's more of a detail. So this is important because the recovery fund for the eurozone is really the key fiscal stimulus that is going to make all the difference. And we made a large table. We can send it to you later, and it basically shows that how the money is allocated, what part will go to grants, what part will go to loans, and what you obviously see and already knew from the newspapers that Spain and Italy are the big receivers, and the Netherlands really not. So now for the Dutch economy, we expect a shrinking of -5.6, which is actually relatively okay-ish compared to other Eurozone countries. I think we have both on the business cycle aspect and on the structural aspect, we have actually pretty good starting conditions going into the crisis. And we have an intranet infrastructure, which is really helping us through this crisis. Now, on a sector base, you see, of course, that leisure is really the place where the biggest hit came. It will also be the place, and we already see that in our day-to-day transactions data, where the recovery is also going pretty fast. So here we see a database of those transaction data, and I think I will stop after that. So what you see is from week to week, we really have the consumer expenditure that is taking place based on PIN transactions for different spending categories. And what you see is that when the lockdown was released in the Netherlands on about the 12th, 13th of May, we saw a very, very slow recovery. And then from the restart, the 1st of June, we see actually that this -4.5. So we're slowly moving into this 95% capacity economy. Okay. And with that, I want to close off.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I realized that you had to do this in the pressure cooker. And I actually, the same applies for the panelists. I think there is only room for one question. And our suggestion would be that Han will raise his question to you, Sandra.
Yeah, hello Sandra, thank you for your presentation. It was short, but clear for me. In the 95% economy, you said, and I saw your figures calculated, that you see that the private consumption in the Netherlands drops 7% and government consumption goes up 2.7%, and still in the 95% economy, then the government is going to spend over 100 billion this year. And if it compared it to the GDP in the Netherlands, that seems a lot of small effect that money has on the economy, or on your predictions. Shouldn't that be much bigger than the impact of the government spending?
Well, actually, the government consumption is just one part of the government spending. So all the stimulus investments are actually in the fixed investment category. Yeah, this is just a methodological difference. But what you see in the 2.7% of government spending, that is government consumption, because you have basically stimulating investments which have the potential of lifting GDP growth, and you have like the expenses that the government makes, for example, social welfare benefits that have to be paid for, and taxes that are not being received by the government. Okay. But that is basically the 2.7.
Okay. How much do we have to spend to get to 100% economy then? How much does the government have to spend extra?
Well, that's very hard to say. That's a very hard question. But like as a rule of thumb, you could say that, but I'm being very careful about this, but you could say that if you stimulate the economy to the extent to which it's shrinking, you should be on the really safe side of spending your way out of the output gap.
Okay.
But this is a really extreme, rough indication.
Yep.
We have another 2 minutes, so Harry or Reinier, I leave it up to you. Harry, maybe you can raise a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. One of your slides you needed to skip because of time. There was a finding that economies that were have a strict lockdown, they were hit harder economically than the countries with a soft lockdown. I think it's obvious, but is it because of the stricter measures, or are these economies weaker?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. I think it's of course the countries which had the hardest hit of the virus were needing the strictest lockdown. I think that the strictness of the lockdown says something first about the virus, but the extent to which countries are able to deal with any given strictness depends on some structural factors, such as, for example, how good is your digital infrastructure? How well are consumers actually used to switching from offline to online consumption? And we see that in Spain and Italy, actually, the digital infrastructure is really bad compared to the north of the Europe. And also, if you compare to Germany, the extent to which people are actually used to buying everything online is something that in Germany people really had to learn. In the Netherlands, people were already doing that.
Yeah, okay. That's a clear answer. Thank you. Thank you, Sandra, again for your presentation. Your presentation, as already was told, will be sent afterwards to the participants of this event. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.